September 7th, 1191. The coastal plain of Arsuf, the Holy Land. A battle that would change the course of the Crusades was about to unfold. 3 key points. The tactical formation. Richard I of England implemented a unique tactical formation that protected his army from Saladin's relentless attacks. This discipline kept the Crusader force intact despite overwhelming odds. The crucial moment. Richard waited for the perfect moment to order a coordinated cavalry charge, which turned the tide of battle and inflicted devastating losses on Saladin's army. Strategic outcome. The victory at Arsuf preserved the Crusader army's fighting capability, enabling Richard to negotiate a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while maintaining Crusader control over the coastal regions. Discover the full story of the Battle of Arsuf and how one man's strategic discipline shaped the future of the Holy Land. Dive into the historical details that led to this monumental clash and learn how patience and strategy triumphed over overwhelming force. Click here to explore more. The morning came burning and cloudless, the way September mornings on the Levantine coast arrive without apology. The Mediterranean sun rising fast over the hills to the east and turning the coastal plain between the sea and the forest into something that the men marching through it would later describe in letters and chronicles and the particular exhausted language of survivors as a corridor of fire and sound that seemed designed specifically to destroy them. The air smelled of dust and blood and the particular sweetness of crushed coastal scrub, sage and thyme ground into the dirt by the boots and hooves of an army of 15,000 men who had been marching south for 3 days and who had not slept without being attacked since they had left Acre. To the east, running parallel to the coast road from the tree line of the forest of Arsuf all the way to the horizon, Saladin's army kept pace. It was enormous. Not enormous the way that armies look enormous from inside them, where the column stretches beyond sight in both directions, and the total size is a matter of mathematics rather than observation. This army was enormous the way that weather is enormous, the way a storm looks enormous when you are standing in the open and can see it coming from every direction simultaneously. 30,000 soldiers, by the estimates that the Crusader chroniclers committed to parchment in the aftermath, and the chroniclers were not given to understatement where Saracen numbers were concerned. Horse archers, thousands of them, riding in the screaming, wheeling, unpredictable patterns of Mamluk and Turkoman cavalry that had already killed hundreds of Crusader soldiers without losing a single engagement over the previous 3 days. Sudanese infantry, crossbowmen, the standards of every emirs in Saladin's vast army, catching the light and the noise of 10,000 mounted men, whose specific purpose was to provoke the Christian knights into a charge that would break the formation and allow the flanking cavalry to roll up the isolated fragments. Inside the column, the Christian army moved with a discipline so extreme it appeared supernatural to everyone watching. 15,000 against 30,000. But the 15,000 were in a formation unlike anything the Saracen commanders had planned against, arranged along the coast road in a structure of such specific tactical intelligence that breaking it required either understanding it, which Saladin did not yet fully do, or triggering its own mechanisms, which he was trying to do with every arrow his cavalry fired, and every screaming charge that peeled away before the Christian knights could respond. The man who had designed that formation was riding somewhere near the center of the column, visible to anyone who could find him in the noise and the dust, not because he wore a crown, but because he was Richard I of England, Richard Plantagenet, called by his people Cœur de Lion, the Lionheart, and he had a specific quality that made him visible in the way that fire is visible in daylight. Not because it outshines the sun, but because it burns with a different quality than everything around it. In approximately 4 hours, he was going to order the charge that he had been refusing to order for 3 days. and when he finally ordered it, on a plain below the ancient town of Arsuf, with the sea at his back and the forest ahead, and Saladin's army pressing from every other direction, the result would be a destruction so complete that Saladin would never again attempt to defeat the Crusader army in open battle. This battle saved Jerusalem. Not permanently. Richard would never take Jerusalem, and that failure would be the tragedy of his crusade. But Arsuf saved the campaign long enough to produce the treaty that preserved Christian access to the Holy City for a generation, and it saved the Crusades from the kind of catastrophic defeat that had been building across 3 days of a march that seemed designed to produce one. The discipline held that morning, for a while. The world before Arsuf. To understand what was at stake on the plain of Arsuf, you have to understand what had happened 4 years before that September morning, and what had happened to the Christian world in the months since. The Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, is one of the decisive battles of the medieval world, and its consequences were so total that understanding Arsuf requires beginning there. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who had reunified the fractured Muslim world around the single objective of reclaiming Jerusalem, had lured the Crusader army of King Guy of Jerusalem away from its water supply on a summer march across the dry hills of Galilee, surrounded it on the double hilltop called the Horns of Hattin, and destroyed it completely. 15,000 soldiers killed or captured. The true cross, the relic that the Crusader army carried into battle as the physical embodiment of divine favor, captured. Guy of Jerusalem himself captured and held prisoner. The military power that had maintained the Crusader states for nearly a century eliminated in a single afternoon. To understand the scale of what Hattin represented, you have to understand what Saladin had spent 20 years building to make it possible. He was not simply a military commander, he was the architect of a political and religious unification of the Islamic world that had not existed before his career began. The Ayyubid dynasty that he founded, and the ideology of jihad that he deployed as its animating force, had converted the fractured collection of competing Muslim princes who had been fighting each other for control of Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia into a coherent force aimed at a single objective. He was Kurdish by ancestry, raised in the traditions of the Zengid Emirate, educated in both military and theological scholarship, and possessed of the particular quality that political and military history identifies in the very rare commanders who change the course of civilizations. The ability to see the entire strategic situation clearly, while also managing the tactical details that allow strategy to be executed. He had taken Egypt in 1169. He had extended his control northward through Syria in the 1170s, absorbing or neutralizing the competing Muslim powers that had previously made a united front against the Crusaders impossible. He had besieged Mosul. He had incorporated Aleppo. He had turned the petty wars between Muslim princes into a consolidated strategic pressure against the Crusader states, and he had waited, with the patience of a man who understood that the Crusader states' central weakness was their dependence on a trickle of reinforcement and supply from Europe that could never match what the surrounding Muslim world could produce when properly organized, for the moment when that weakness could be exploited decisively. Hattin was that moment. Saladin moved with characteristic swiftness through the military vacuum that Hattin created. He took Acre, he took Jaffa, he took Caesarea and Ascalon and Sidon and Beirut. He took Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, entering in triumph the city that had been taken from Islam in the First Crusade of 1099 and that the Crusader states had held for 88 years. He converted the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to a mosque. He washed the Dome of the Rock with rose water brought specially from Damascus. Europe's response was immediate and comprehensive in the way that catastrophes to the Christian world produced comprehensive responses when the right men in the right positions decided to act. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull that called for the Third Crusade within days of receiving the news. 3 kings responded personally: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia before he reached the Holy Land. Philip and Richard arrived, Philip first, Richard soon after, at the siege of Acre, which had been grinding through its second year when they appeared, and which they resolved in 5 weeks of combined operations that produced the first major Crusader victory since Hattin. The fall of Acre on July 12, 1191, was where Arsuf's story truly began, because it was at Acre that Richard made the decision that would define his Crusades' character, and that Saladin would spend the next months trying to answer. Richard was 33 years old when he took the cross, and 33 years old when he stood outside Acre, waiting for the surrender negotiations to complete. He was a king in the fullest sense of the medieval understanding of kingship, a man whose identity was military, whose training since childhood had been for war, who had been fighting his own father and his own brothers and the enemies of Plantagenet authority since he was 16 years old, and who had never lost a campaign. He spoke Occitan better than English, spent perhaps 6 months total in England during his 10-year reign, and understood his kingship primarily as a military and administrative function, rather than as a domestic responsibility. He was physically extraordinary, tall, red-haired, strong enough that the sources describe him performing feats in battle that would be exaggerated if they came from less reliable witnesses. He was also a commander of genuine tactical intelligence, a man who thought about the geometry of battle in the specific way that separates commanders who win against superior numbers from commanders who simply fight and hope. The incident at Acre that preceded Arsuf shaped every subsequent engagement. When the terms of Acre's surrender included a provision for the ransom of the Muslim garrison, and when Saladin delayed the payment past the agreed deadline, Richard had 2,700 Muslim prisoners executed outside the city walls in view of Saladin's army on the hills above. The act was brutal in a way that even the medieval standards of siege warfare found noteworthy. It was also a strategic communication. Richard was not going to be delayed by negotiations, was not going to be deterred by the prospect of retaliation, and was going to operate on a timeline determined by the strategic necessity of moving south toward Jerusalem before the summer campaign season ended. Saladin's response was fury, and the military decision of his own. He would destroy the Crusader army on its march south. If he could replicate something like Hattin, if he could break the formation, isolate the knights from the infantry, and turn the march into the chaos that the Muslim horse archers excelled at exploiting, he could end the Third Crusade the way he had ended the Second Crusade's military capacity. He had the army, he had the ground, he had the tactics. All he needed was for the Crusaders to make the mistake he was trying to provoke them into making. But between Saladin's plan and its execution stood the specific problem of Richard Plantagenet, who had been in the Holy Land for approximately 6 weeks, and who had already demonstrated that he was a different category of opponent from anything the Saracen commanders had faced since the First Crusade. The march from Acre to Jaffa began on August 22nd. By September 3rd, the army had covered roughly half the distance, at the cost of constant harassment that had killed hundreds and exhausted the rest. But the formation had not broken. The knights had not charged. Richard was still in control. Philip II of France had already left, claiming illness, which may have been genuine and was certainly convenient for a king who had more to gain from Richard's absence in France than from continued cooperation in the Holy Land. The French contingent that remained fought under its own commanders, who acknowledged Richard's authority only when it suited them. The Hospitallers held the rear. The Templars held the van. The English, Normans, Bretons, Angevins, and Poitevins held the center. Between them and the sea, supply ships from the Crusader fleet kept pace, providing the water and food without which the march could not survive in the September heat. And all the time, Saladin's army pressed. The march and the plan. The coastal plain between Acre and Jaffa is not a dramatic landscape. It is a narrow strip of flat agricultural ground between the Mediterranean Sea to the west and the hills of the Judean foothills to the east, with the occasional river crossing and the occasional patch of forest breaking the agricultural monotony. In September 1191, it was dry, dusty, and hot. The harvest month, when the grain stubble in the fields was the color of bleached bone, and the dust that an army of 15,000 raised was visible for 20 miles in any direction. The road south ran close to the coast, close enough that the salt smell of the sea mixed with the dust of the march, and close enough that the fleet keeping pace offshore could see the column's progress and match it with the supply ships that were the army's logistical lifeline. Richard had chosen the coastal route specifically because it gave him one secure flank, the sea to the west, where Saladin's cavalry could not go, and because it allowed the fleet to supply the army with the water and provisions that the scorched earth policy Saladin had applied to the inland routes had made impossible to find on the land. But the coast road also funneled the army between the sea and the hills in a way that reduced Saladin's tactical options while also limiting Richard's. The army could not spread wide. It could not maneuver freely. It had to advance in column, and the column had to maintain its cohesion against the harassment that was constant from the landward side from the moment the march began. Richard's tactical response to this constraint was the formation that his commanders had drilled into the army during the weeks at Acre, and that was now being tested under live fire conditions for the first time at full scale. The formation was, in principle, simple. The infantry formed on the outer edge of the column, the side facing the attack, walking close enough together that their shields made a continuous wall, and their crossbows could fire outward continuously. The knights rode inside this infantry wall, protected from the arrow fire, maintaining their horses' strength for the one charge that would matter. The baggage train and the wounded moved between the cavalry and the sea, protected on three sides by the infantry, the knights, and the coast. The specific innovation of Richard's formation was not the shield wall. That was as old as warfare. It was the discipline he imposed on the cavalry. The whole theory of Crusader tactics in the East, the theory that Saladin had been using as his operational template since before Hattin, was that the Muslim horse archers could provoke the Christian knights into a premature charge by shooting horses and men until the knights could no longer endure the provocation and broke formation to pursue. Once they broke formation, the horse archers withdrew at speed. Their horses were lighter and faster than the heavy destriers, drawing the knights away from the infantry protection, allowing the flanking cavalry to surround and destroy them, and then turning back to deal with the now unsupported infantry at leisure. It had worked at Hattin. It had worked in a dozen smaller engagements. It was working in the early days of the Acre to Jaffa march, in the sense that it was killing Crusader soldiers and horses, but it was not producing the charge because Richard would not give the order. The war council that Richard held on the evening of September 5th, 2 days into the march, 1 day before the battle, is not documented in the detailed way that later military historians documented such deliberations, but its general shape is recoverable from the sources. The Hospitaller master had already communicated through messengers that his rear guard was at the limit of what it could endure. The Templar van commander had similar concerns about the forward elements. The French lords, Conrad of Montferrat's men, the Burgundian contingent, the remnants of Philip's force, were fighting effectively, but acknowledged no obligation to continue fighting if Richard's strategy failed to produce results. The Italo-Norman Crusaders from southern Italy and Sicily were reliable but limited in numbers. Richard's message to all of them was the same, and it was short. Hold. Do not charge. The trumpet will sound, and when it sounds, everyone charges together. Not before. He knew what he was asking was almost impossible. Not physically impossible. The knights were professionals who could, in principle, hold their discipline under arrow fire. But psychologically, almost impossible, because there is a specific state of mind that a knight in armor reaches after several hours of watching his horse be killed around him, and his companions die at his sides from arrows he cannot respond to. A state in which every trained instinct, every reflex of the nobility's warrior tradition, every principle of honor that the military culture of medieval Europe had produced over centuries tells him that the only response to this is to charge. And Richard was asking them not to follow that instinct, to sit inside the arrow storm, to take the deaths, to wait. He rode the column constantly during the march, repositioning himself to wherever the pressure was greatest, directing the crossbow fire, ordering withdrawals when sections of the infantry wall were under too much pressure, keeping the formation intact by the force of his personal presence and the specific authority of a king who his soldiers believed was incapable of making a wrong tactical decision. His method of maintaining discipline in the cavalry was direct and pragmatic. He stationed himself where the knights were most likely to break, and the knights knew that breaking the formation in front of the king was not an option they were willing to consider. The march of September 6th into the plain of Arsuf was the third consecutive day of maximum pressure. Saladin had reinforced his attacking force with cavalry from his reserve, and the intensity of the arrow fire and the screaming charges had been increasing as the day progressed. The forest of Arsuf, ahead and to the east of the column, gave the Muslim cavalry better cover than the open plain had offered, and the attacks were coming faster and from shorter distances. The horses in the cavalry reserve, the destriers that represented years of breeding and training and enormous financial investment, the animals without which the knights were simply heavily armored infantry, were showing the cumulative effect of 3 days under arrow fire. Several dozen had been killed, many more were wounded. The riders on them were exhausted and furious in the way that men become furious when they have been enduring something intolerable for a long time and can see the means of ending it, but have been forbidden to use those means. Richard had already decided that the charge would come today. The question was not whether, but when and how. He wanted it to come at maximum advantage, when the Muslim cavalry was committed to a close attack rather than wheeling at range, when the horses were in motion toward him rather than away from him, when the destruction would be complete rather than partial, because the distance the Muslim cavalry had to cover to reach safety was maximum rather than minimum. He communicated this to his commanders with the specific instruction that has been recorded in the chronicles. The charge would be signaled by 6 trumpet blasts. The army would hold. When the 6 blasts came, every knight would charge simultaneously, from one end of the line to the other, the full weight of 1,500 heavy cavalry going forward in a single coordinated movement that nothing in Saladin's experience had prepared him for. The knights would hold until they heard the trumpet. The night before Arsuf, September 6th, camped on the plain with the fires of Saladin's army visible to the east, passed in the specific way that the night before a battle passes for men who are not in command and cannot do anything but wait. The army had its rituals, and they performed them. The priests moved through the camp with the host and with absolution, and the soldiers received both with the focused attention of men who understood that tomorrow was the kind of day for which absolution was specifically designed. The knights checked their horses and their equipment and checked them again, not from nervousness exactly, but from the professional habit of men who had survived by being thorough. The infantry, the sergeants and the foot soldiers and the crossbowmen who had been walking in the arrow fire for 3 days, sat by their fires and ate whatever food the supply ships had provided, and did not speak much, because there was not much to say that the man beside you did not already know. There was a specific kind of soldier in that army who had been in the Holy Land for a generation rather than a year. The Crusader lords and the military order brothers, the Hospitallers and the Templars, who had been born in the Crusader states, or who had arrived young enough to have spent more of their adult lives there than anywhere else. These men understood the stakes of the following morning in a way that the newly arrived Crusaders from England and France could not. They had watched Hattin happen at a distance. They had spent 4 years living in the reduced coastal remnants of a Crusader presence that Hattin had left. They had seen what the loss of Jerusalem meant in the practical daily terms of a Christian minority in a landscape that now regarded them as a temporary inconvenience to be expelled, rather than a permanent institution to be negotiated with. For them, the march south was not an adventure. It was the last chance. Richard himself moved through the camp as he had moved through the march, not ceremonially, not performing the role of the inspirational king, but actively, checking the positions and the supplies and the condition of the men with the practical attention of a commander who understood that tomorrow depended not on morale speeches, but on whether the crossbow bolts were dry and the horses had enough water. The fires went out, one by one. The sea moved against the shore in the dark. To the east, Saladin's camp was larger and louder and would burn through the night, because an army of 30,000 needs more fuel than an army of 15,000 and has less reason to be quiet. Morning came burning and cloudless. The battle. The attack began before the column had fully formed for the day's march. This was Saladin's tactical preference throughout the march, to hit the army when it was in transition, when the formation was incomplete, when the discipline that Richard had imposed was most likely to fracture under the combined pressure of movement and attack simultaneously. The Muslim cavalry swept out of the forest of Arsuf as the column was organizing its march order, the horse archers coming in waves from the east and southeast, screaming. The sources describe the noise as overwhelming, a continuous combination of war cries and drums, and the specific shrieking of the Turkoman cavalry that was designed to frighten horses as much as men. And the arrow fire was immediate and from close range. The smell of that morning was the smell of the previous 3 days, concentrated. Dust and blood and horse sweat and the acrid burned wood smell of spent arrows whose fletchings had been ignited in the bow before release, a technique that the Muslim archers used to add the psychological effect of fire to the physical effect of impact. The sound was the wall of noise that medieval armies produced at full engagement: the drums, the horns, the war cries in Arabic and Turkic, the screaming of wounded horses, the distinctive crack of crossbow bolts being loosed, and the impact of arrows on shields and armor. And underneath all of this, the particular percussion of a column of 15,000 soldiers maintaining their march discipline under conditions designed to break it. The Crusader formation held. The crossbowmen on the outer wall fired in rotation, one rank firing while the rank behind them reloaded, the system that maximized rate of fire without the gaps that a single rank's reload cycle would produce. The infantry walked with their shields against the arrows and their faces forward and did not break. The knights inside the infantry wall walked their horses and did not charge. The specific experience of a crossbowman in that outer wall deserves its own moment in the telling. These men were not knights, They were professional soldiers and mercenaries and volunteers and peasants who had been trained in the use of the most powerful infantry weapon of the era, the crossbow, which required considerably more skill to load and aim accurately than its reputation as a simple mechanical device suggests, and which, in the hands of a trained operator, could deliver a bolt with enough force to penetrate chainmail at 200 meters and plate armor at closer ranges. They loaded and fired not in excitement or in fury, but in the focused, repetitive, professional rhythm of men who had a job to do and who were doing it under conditions that required them to ignore everything except the job. The arrows coming in from the Muslim cavalry struck their shields and their comrades beside them, and occasionally struck them, and they loaded and fired and did not break. By mid-morning, the pressure had reached a level that the chronicles describe with a specificity that suggests the writers were working from their own memory rather than from received accounts. The Muslim cavalry was not coming in at long range and withdrawing as it had in the first days of the march. It was coming in close enough that individual riders could be identified by their armor and their standards, close enough that the horse archers were firing not from 80 meters but from 30, and at 30 meters a composite bow delivers an arrow with enough force to penetrate chainmail. The Crusader infantry was walking through an arrow storm at point-blank range, and the casualties were mounting in the way that casualties mount when there is no cover and no option but to keep moving. The Hospitallers held the rear of the column, and the rear was receiving the worst of it. The rear was always worst. It was where Saladin concentrated the heaviest pressure because it was furthest from the van where Richard rode, furthest from the command that could order the charge, the place where the discipline was most likely to fracture first. The Hospitaller master Garnier de Nobles sent message after message forward to Richard. "We cannot hold much longer. Give the order." Richard sent messages back. "Hold." The Hospitaller brothers, those knights of the military order who had taken vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, and who had been fighting in the Holy Land for years before Richard arrived, held. They held through the morning and into the early afternoon. They held while their horses were hit and their comrades died beside them. They held under conditions that would have broken any conventional cavalry unit, and they held because the Hospitaller tradition of absolute obedience to the order's master, and through him to the overall commander, was the only thing holding them in place. Hours into the battle, something broke. Not the Hospitaller formation, not the surrender of the formation to chaos, but two knights, separately identified in the chronicles as a marshal of the Hospitallers and a companion, could not hold any longer. They turned their horses and charged into 30,000. The charge of the two Hospitaller knights was premature. Richard had not given the order, the 6 trumpets had not sounded, the optimal moment of maximum Muslim cavalry exposure had not yet arrived. But once the two knights had gone forward, the calculation changed instantly. The rear of the column was committed to a charge whether Richard ordered one or not, and a partial charge, unsupported, uncoordinated, hitting Saladin's cavalry without the full weight of the Crusader force, was a recipe for the destruction that Saladin had been engineering for 3 days. Richard gave the order. The 6 trumpets sounded from one end of the column to the other, and 1,500 heavy cavalry went forward simultaneously from their protected positions inside the infantry screen. The impact of a full Crusader cavalry charge was something that no cavalry in the medieval world had been fully prepared for at the first experience of it. The destrier, the great war horses of the Crusader knights, animals bred specifically for combat, standing 16 hands at the shoulder and weighing over 1,000 pounds, moving at a canter with a knight in full armor on their back, produced a physical impact when they hit formed infantry or cavalry that the sources describe as being like the impact of a battering ram. A single knight in full charge was a weapon weighing close to 2,000 pounds moving at speed. 1,500 of them, going forward together across a front of 3 miles, produced a kinetic force that the physics of the era had no vocabulary to describe, but that every soldier who survived it and wrote about it described in terms that made clear it was unlike anything else in their experience. Saladin's cavalry was in the close-in attack position when the trumpet sounded. They were 30 to 50 meters from the Crusader infantry screen, committed to the charge angle, their horses moving toward the Christian formation, when the Christian formation suddenly reversed direction and came toward them at full speed. They could not withdraw fast enough. The Muslim horse archers' tactical doctrine was built on speed and maneuver. Hit and withdraw before the heavier Christian cavalry could close the distance. This worked at range. It worked when the withdrawal began before the knights were in motion. It did not work when the knights were already moving and the distance between the two forces was 30 meters rather than 300. The rear of the Saracen cavalry formation, the riders who had been in the close attack, had no room to withdraw before the Christian charge hit them. The front of the Christian charge hid them traveling at full momentum, and what followed was not a cavalry engagement in the tactical sense. It was a collision, the destruction of a mass of men and horses by the simple physics of impact and weight differential. The Crusader right wing drove through the Muslim cavalry and into the Muslim infantry beyond it. The center followed. The left flank, where the Hospitaller Knights had begun the charge prematurely, had already broken through the near cavalry screen and was engaging the flanking force that Saladin had positioned specifically to exploit the unsupported charge that Richard had refused to make until now. But now it was supported. Now it was all 3 sections of the Crusader cavalry charging simultaneously, driving through the Muslim close attack formation and out the other side, turning, reforming, charging again. The Muslim cavalry that survived the first impact withdrew at speed, but did not have the space or the time to withdraw far enough to regain formation before the second Crusader charge hit. Saladin watched from a hill above the plain. He understood immediately what had gone wrong. The charge had come at the worst possible moment from his tactical perspective, when his cavalry was maximally committed to the close attack, when the space between his attacking force and his main army was occupied by the rear of the attacking force itself, when a Crusader charge into the Muslim formation would not find open ground and the possibility of withdrawal, but would find packed cavalry with nowhere to run. He sent orders, he sent reserves, he rode down from the hill toward the fighting himself, according to multiple sources, and tried personally to rally units that were streaming away from the combat. It was too late for the units that had been hit. They were destroyed, not routed, destroyed, the specific military term for a formation so comprehensively broken that it cannot be reconstituted from its surviving elements. But it was not too late for the battle overall, because the Crusader charge was now deep in the Muslim position and at risk of the isolation that Saladin had been trying to engineer since Acre. Richard sounded the recall. The discipline that had held for 3 days of march now had to hold through the most dangerous moment of the battle, the withdrawal from the charge back to the formation. Knights, in the exhilaration of a successful charge, having broken through everything in front of them, do not naturally stop and turn around. They pursue, they kill. They follow the fleeing enemy for as long as the enemy keeps running and the horse has strength to follow. This is what produces the catastrophic overextension that turns a tactical victory into a strategic defeat. This is what Hattin's survivor accounts describe happening to the Christian cavalry at Saladin's trap at Cresson the year before Hattin, where a small force was destroyed precisely because the knights pursued past the point of safety and were surrounded. Richard sounded the recall, and the knights turned back. Not all of them, and not immediately, The sources describe some pursuits that extended further than Richard intended, and the reforming of the Crusader cavalry line was messier than the charge had been. But enough of them turned, and turned fast enough, that when Saladin's flanking cavalry swept in from the north, attempting to cut off the extended charge from the main formation, they found not isolated knights strung out across the plain, but a reforming line that was already contracting back toward the infantry screen. The flanking attack hit the reforming Crusader cavalry on the right. The fighting here was the most intense of the battle. Not the clean impact of the initial charge, but the grinding, close-range combat of cavalry against cavalry, where the individual skill of rider and horse determined the outcome, rather than the collective weight of a formation moving together. Richard himself was in this fighting. The sources, 3 separate chronicles, 2 from the Christian side and 1 Arabic source, describe him moving through this engagement with the particular quality that military historians call command presence, and that the medieval sources describe as something they had no vocabulary for except miracle. Fighting his way through the flanking force, maintaining his personal position at the most dangerous point of the engagement, visible to his men, continuing to control the battle from inside it. His personal weapon of choice in this fighting was the crossbow, which the sources note because it was unusual for a king to carry and operate his own ranged weapon in the midst of a cavalry engagement. He used it against individual targets, the Saracen cavalry commanders who were visible by their standards and their armor, the men whose deaths would create command vacuums in the formations pressing against his right. He rode through his own cavalry, firing as he went, according to Baha ad-Din's account, and the Arabic source notes this with a specific quality of reluctant admiration that suggests the chronicler had difficulty reconciling what he was describing with the expected behavior of a king. Richard was not performing majesty on that plain. He was doing the work of a captain who happened to wear a crown. The flanking attack broke against the reforming Crusader line and withdrew. Saladin's cavalry was spent, the close attack force destroyed, the flanking force repulsed, the reserves committed and failed. The Muslim army that had been pressing the Crusader column for 3 days, and that had come within a single premature charge of destroying it, was withdrawing from the plain of Arsuf before midday. The retreat was not a rout. This is worth emphasizing because it illustrates one of the central qualities that made Saladin the opponent he was. Even in defeat, his army withdrew with its command structure intact, its non-cavalry forces in order, the specific professionalism of a force that had lost an engagement but had not lost its discipline. The horse archers who had survived the charge rallied at distances beyond effective pursuit range and provided a screen behind which the more vulnerable infantry and the artillery components of Saladin's army could withdraw in order. Saladin himself was at the rear of his withdrawing force, riding toward his camp, according to his own chronicler's account, in a state of fury and grief that he expressed, characteristically, not through rage, but through silence. The pursuit, such as it was limited. Richard did not chase Saladin's army beyond the plain. He reformed his force and continued the march south. The Battle of Arsuf had lasted approximately 6 hours. The field and the reckoning. The plain of Arsuf in the afternoon of September 7th was a landscape that the surviving accounts describe with a restraint that speaks to the magnitude of what they are declining to describe in detail. The Muslim casualties were, by the estimates available in the sources, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 killed, a range that reflects both the genuine uncertainty of medieval casualty accounting and the specific difficulty of counting dead on a field where the winning army did not stop to count and the losing army did not advertise. The specific figure of 7,000 dead Muslim soldiers appears in multiple independent accounts and is generally accepted by modern historians as the lower bound of a plausible range. The Christian sources, which tend toward inflation, give higher numbers that most historians treat with the appropriate skepticism. What is not in dispute is the proportion. The Crusader casualties were a fraction of the Muslim losses, perhaps 700 killed and wounded out of 15,000 engaged, a casualty ratio that reflects the specific tactical asymmetry of a prepared, disciplined charge against cavalry that could not withdraw fast enough to avoid the impact. Saladin himself was not killed or captured. He withdrew with what remained of his command structure and his reserve forces, and the withdrawal was, by the accounts of his own chroniclers and secretaries, particularly the remarkable Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who accompanied the Sultan's campaigns and whose account of Arsuf is among the most honest military histories produced by any side in the crusading era, orderly in the way that a withdrawal can be orderly when the army's discipline holds even as its combat power is spent. Saladin was not broken by Arsuf. He was damaged in the specific way that a military reputation is damaged, not by defeat itself, since defeat happens to great commanders, but by the particular quality of this defeat. A defeat in open battle, on ground he had chosen, against an opponent he had been trying to destroy for 3 days, whose plan he had anticipated, and who had executed his own plan at the precise moment that made Saladin's plan unworkable. The Crusader army camped on the plain of Arsuf that night, for the first time in 3 days without being attacked. The field was quiet in the September evening. The Mediterranean was audible to the west, the same sound it had made before the battle and would make after it had been forgotten. The dead were there in the numbers that a major engagement produces. Muslim soldiers in the patterns of the charge impact and the pursuit's edge. Christian soldiers fewer and concentrated in the places where the arrow fire had been densest. The horses, too, those expensive, irreplaceable destriers, and the lighter Arab horses of the Saracen cavalry, scattered in the way that battle horses end up, far from the positions where they fell. The army that rested on that field was still intact. That was the essential fact. 3 days of the most intense, harassing attack that Saladin had mounted since the campaign began, followed by the most dangerous moment of the march, the premature charge, the signal given under pressure rather than plan, had not broken the Crusader force. It was smaller and more tired than it had been at Acre, but it was coherent. It had a line of march, a command structure, a supply system functioning from the fleet. It could continue south. Richard continued south. The battle that changed the crusade. Arsuf did not win the Third Crusade. That is the honest reckoning that the celebration of the victory sometimes obscures, and it deserves to be stated clearly before the battle's genuine significance is examined. Richard took Jaffa. He rebuilt Ascalon. He marched within 12 miles of Jerusalem twice and turned back both times, because he understood, in a judgment that his contemporaries in the Crusader leadership did not fully accept and that caused him significant political trouble, that taking Jerusalem with a force that could not hold it was worse than not taking it at all. His supply line was too long. His force was too small to garrison the city and defeat Saladin's relief army simultaneously. The Crusader lords whose support he needed to hold the Holy Land once he had taken it were factional, unreliable, and in some cases actively working against him for reasons of their own political interest. He came to terms with Saladin in September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa, which gave Christians access to the Holy City without controlling it, and left the coast in Crusader hands, and left Jerusalem under Muslim governance. It was a compromise that satisfied neither side fully, and that posterity has judged with the mixed verdict that compromises tend to receive. But it was a sustainable arrangement, and it held. Arsuf made it possible. Without Arsuf, there is no Jaffa, no negotiated access to Jerusalem, no Crusader coastal strip to negotiate from. Without Arsuf, the Third Crusade ended in the destruction of the Crusader field army on the march south from Acre, and the permanent reduction of Christian presence in the Holy Land to whatever coastal cities could be defended independently, without a field army to support them. The strategic consequence of Arsuf was to preserve the military instrument through which Richard's diplomatic result was eventually achieved. Not the result he had come for, but a result that was better than nothing, and significantly better than the result of a destroyed army. The longer impact on crusading warfare was immediate and absorbed. Every subsequent Crusader military commander understood, in ways that their predecessors had not, that the Muslim cavalry's tactical doctrine, provoke the charge, withdraw, surround the overextended knights, had been answered by Richard's formation and his discipline. The answer was not a new weapon or a new formation in the technical sense. It was a new quality of command that could impose on armored knights in the heat and the arrow fire and the screaming of the Muslim charges the specific discipline of not charging until the moment was right. This quality of command was rare. Richard had it. Most of his successors did not, and the battles of subsequent crusades demonstrate the consequence of its absence in ways that make Arsuf's achievement more visible in retrospect. Saladin's own military thinking was permanently affected by Arsuf. He never again offered the Crusader field army an open battle. The remaining year of the Third Crusade, after Arsuf, was fought in a different mode. Raids, skirmishes, the battle over fortifications and supply lines, the diplomatic negotiation that eventually produced the treaty. Saladin was not broken by Arsuf, but he had learned something from it that he did not already know. That Richard's army, if it maintained its formation, could not be defeated in the manner he had been using, and that a different approach was required. He died in March 1193, 6 months after the treaty, before he could fully develop what that different approach might be. The two men, Richard and Saladin, were the complementary figures of an era, the Christian and Muslim commanders whose personal qualities and whose direct engagement with each other across a year of campaigning produced something that the partisan histories of both traditions have found difficult to characterize cleanly. The Muslim chronicles note Richard's cruelty. The execution of the Acre prisoners was not forgotten, and his battlefield genius. The Crusader chronicles note Saladin's chivalry, his mercy, his administrative competence, and the specific quality of his defeat at Arsuf, with an admiration that makes clear they respected the opponent they had beaten. The two men apparently sent gifts to each other during the campaign: horses, fruit, ice from Mount Hermon, the small gestures of professional mutual recognition between commanders who were trying to kill each other, and who acknowledged that the man across the line was worthy of the acknowledgement. This mutual acknowledgement between opponents across a religious and civilizational divide was not the norm of the crusading era, and it should not be romanticized into something it was not. The Third Crusade was fought with specific medieval brutalities on both sides: the Acre prisoners, the Saracen wounded left on the battlefield, the civilian populations caught between the armies, the city of Jaffa sacked and burned and re-sacked and reoccupied in the fighting of 1192. The mutual respect between the two commanders was real and documented and historically remarkable. It did not prevent any of the killing. It simply meant that the men doing the killing understood each other's capabilities and, in some specific sense, honored them. Neither of them got what he came for. Saladin did not destroy the Third Crusade. Richard did not take Jerusalem. Both of them produced outcomes that history has judged as something other than victory or defeat. As the specific mixed result of two extraordinary men applying their full capabilities against each other across a year of war, and finding that neither could overwhelm the other completely. Centuries later, the plain of Arsuf is in the modern state of Israel, the coastal region south of Haifa, known today as the Sharon Plain. Arsuf itself, the ancient town on the hill above the battlefield, is an archaeological site, its Crusader and earlier fortifications partially excavated and open to visitors. The coastal road that Richard's army marched south along is now a highway. The sea that marked the western flank of his formation is the same sea, the same Mediterranean, making the same noise against the same coast that it made in September 1191. There is no monument to the battle on the plain. The battlefield is not marked. The ground does not announce what happened there. It is agricultural land and highway and the ordinary infrastructure of a modern country. And the specific patch of ground where the 6th trumpet blast sounded and 1,500 knights went forward is indistinguishable from the ground on either side of it. But the trumpet sounded here, and the charge that it released, the most disciplined cavalry action of the Crusading era, the product of 3 days of endurance and 1 moment of precise command, shaped the history of the Holy Land for the century that followed. Richard turned back at the gates of Jerusalem, but he never let his army be destroyed, and in the mathematics of what he came for, the second fact made the first tolerable. The discipline held until it did not, and then Richard held it again. What Arsuf demonstrated, and what military history has taken from it in the 8 centuries since, is that discipline is not the absence of instinct. It is the ability to feel the instinct completely, to feel the pull of the charge with everything you are, and to hold it until the moment when releasing it does the most damage. The 2 Hospitaller knights who charged prematurely understood this too late. Richard understood it completely. The difference between those 2 understandings was the battle. The trumpet sounded, the horses went forward. The miracle of Arsuf was not the charge, it was the waiting.